Hello and welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Tim Smith and joining us today is Dr. Roberto Garcia. Dr. Garcia is a clinical professor of international business at the Kelley School of Business here at Indiana University, Bloomington, and also serves as director for the IU Center for International Business Education and Research. Dr. Garcia's research covers a wide range of international business topics and business teaching effectiveness, and he has received several honors and awards for his contribution to international business teaching and service. Recently, U.S. President Donald Trump has called for an update and renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, a 23-year-old trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Dr. Garcia joins us today to share his insights on NAFTA and the implications updating NAFTA and the implications that it could have on the U.S. and our closest trade partners, Mexico and Canada. Roberto, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Tim. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Well, to start, could you give us a quick explanation of what NAFTA is and how it's impacted the United States economy since its inception and implementation in 1994?
Sure. So NAFTA stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. It was negotiated in 1992 by President H.W. Bush, President Carlos Salinas of Mexico, and Prime Minister Brian Mulroney of Canada. Okay. And the agreement itself was signed by Congress in 1993, and then it was signed by President Bill Clinton also later on in 1993. It went into effect on January 1st, 1994. While the U.S. had entered into many free trade agreements, that was the first time that two highly developed industrialized countries, Canada and the U.S., joined a partner that was much less developed, Mexico. And so from the beginning, it was controversial because it was new in that aspect.
Yeah. Well, great. So, of course, now that our current president has decided not to follow with TPP and sign that international trade agreement, what about NAFTA now, and what about perspectives, Roberto? Maybe you could share your thoughts about the U.S., Canada, and Mexico's perspective regarding the NAFTA agreement.
So to understand the effects of NAFTA, Tim, it's important to keep in mind that when NAFTA was being negotiated, there were very strong supporters of NAFTA, and there were very strong critics. It was very divisive. And so the proponents of NAFTA claimed that millions of jobs would be created in the United States, that trade with Mexico and Canada would increase by a tremendous amount, and that economic disparity in Mexico would be greatly improved, and that immigration from Mexico to the United States would also be greatly reduced. The critics of NAFTA, as you might recall, one of the strongest critics argued that if NAFTA would go into effect, there would be a huge sucking sound of jobs going from the U.S. to Mexico in particular, that the agriculture sector in Mexico would be devastated, and that millions of people in Mexico would be left out of a job, and then they would then be forced to migrate illegally to the United States. That also critics would argue that the environment would be devastated, that there would be a lot of environmental contamination, and that this would be an open invitation for U.S. and Canadian firms to exploit Mexican labor, right? And so you have the proponents and the critics, and what actually ended up happening 23 years later is that neither the positive picture that some argued or the gloom and doom scenario, neither of those happened. And what happened, though, was that for Canada, clearly NAFTA has been good, right? It has created more jobs, it has increased wages, it has allowed companies to be more efficient. What happened in the U.S., though, is that the results were modest. They were on the positive side. Really, no one, no economist really argues that NAFTA has been a disaster for the U.S. It has been modestly positive, right? So there wasn't a huge sucking sound of jobs that went to Mexico. There have been a modest number of jobs overall that have been created in the U.S. And so there hasn't been the gloom and doom scenario. What has happened, though, for the three countries is that because tariffs have gone down and because foreign direct investment restrictions have gone down, and because there has been sort of a comparative advantage of companies to do some of their production in Mexico, there has been an integration of industries. The auto industry is one of those. Electronics is another one of those. Clothing and textiles. So there has kind of been a division of labor for firms between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. And so that has allowed firms to be much more efficient compared to efficient and competitive with other regions of the world like Europe and Asia, for example. Now, what has complicated the picture is that a lot of things happened when NAFTA went into effect that have sort of clouded the results. One of those is that right after NAFTA went into effect, there was a severe currency crisis in Mexico. So that impacted the Mexican economy from the very beginning very negatively. What also happened is that in the 1990s, jobs were booming. Under the Clinton administration, the U.S. economy was booming. And so there were many, many more jobs created overall in the U.S. that clouded, the results of just NAFTA alone. And then we had the September 11th, 2001 World Trade Tower bombings, which also affected trade between the three countries. That sort of got in the way. In 2008, then we had the financial crisis.
Of course.
And so all of those effects have made it more difficult for the results to be sorted out between the three countries.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you for taking us through that and helping me and others understand a little bit more specifically about how the trade agreement has been measured and evaluated and how it's contributed to the different countries. So maybe now we could talk a little bit about currently and about the perspectives, Roberto, from the different countries in renegotiating this 23-year-old contract. What are some of your thoughts about perspectives from the three participating countries in the agreement?
In terms of where we go from here, I see three scenarios, right? One is that NAFTA is repealed. That is a possibility, right? Repealing of NAFTA. If that happens, what would happen there is that the president would give Congress a 30-day notice with the intention to repeal. And if that happens, and let's say NAFTA is repealed, right? Trade between the three countries doesn't end automatically. What happens is the trade rules go back to the time before NAFTA, which are the trade rules under the World Trade Organization.
Okay.
And that means that the tariffs that existed before NAFTA and the restrictions that existed before NAFTA would go into effect. Okay? And the short answer of what would happen in the U.S. is that tariffs for the tariffs would go up to the point from the point where they are now. It would actually hurt the U.S. companies a little bit more than Mexican companies, because before NAFTA, the tariffs and other restrictions between Canada and the U.S. and Mexico and the rest of the world were already pretty low. Right?
Okay.
Mexico's tariffs were higher, and so really what would happen is U.S. companies would face slightly higher tariffs on the Mexican side. So that's one scenario. The more likely scenario, though, is something like a renegotiation of NAFTA. And what's happening right now is that all three countries are, of course, the U.S. And President Trump has campaigned with the intention to renegotiate NAFTA. So what happens is that Mexico and Canada are also opening open to renegotiating NAFTA. And the way that I think of it, where we are right now, is sort of like with the Affordable Care Act, right? So we are in the process of repeal and replace, or some kind of a replace. And so where we are right now is that the three countries, particularly Canada and Mexico, are open to keeping what has worked well for NAFTA in terms of the integration of many industries and the smooth operations of companies, a dispersed supply chain where some parts are, let's say, made in the US and Canada, they cross over into Mexico, they come back from Mexico. There are many parts and components that cross the border several times before the product is being assembled and then sold to the final consumer. And so if that process is kept and trade is not disrupted too much, then there could be some improvements to NAFTA. For example, environmental and labor conditions could be better enforced and improved in that sense. Regulations could also be reduced for all three of the countries in order to help companies function more smoothly. If labor conditions also improved in Mexico, and let's say labor rights improved, wages could come up in Mexico. And if that was the case, then there would be less pressure on job relocation from the US to Mexico. A place where all three countries would benefit would be if the local content regulations were to be increased from a current level of about 50%. That is, if you want to sell a product in the NAFTA region right now, you'd have to have about 50% of the content originate in the three countries, right? And so that still allows some incentives for countries outside of the NAFTA area to continue to make their products outside of the NAFTA region. And so if local content regulations were increased, let's say to 90%, then many more companies would, from other regions outside of NAFTA would be induced to come and manufacture in the US, in Canada, or in Mexico to be able to sell within the region. And that would help all three countries. That would increase employment.
Okay.
And so those are some of the main effects that could improve NAFTA without necessarily doing away with it. Now, there's a minor cosmetic effect, I think, that would also help to change the name of NAFTA. NAFTA has become sort of a label that is seen very negatively. So I think the cosmetic effect of changing the name of NAFTA, I think, would also allow the current administration to make good in its promise to improve NAFTA, right?
A rebranding of sorts.
Rebranding of it, yeah. And I think all three countries would be open to that.
Yeah. Well, Roberto, great. Thank you so much for your insight and your thoughts. We appreciate it very much. Thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's all we have for this edition of Cyber Focus, and all the time we have for it. So thank you for tuning in, and if you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please let us know at CIBER, that's CIBER, @indiana.edu.